All right, well, quite the man joining me today, Camden Stone, with one of the leading voices in LA sports. You might have seen him on Fox Sports covering college football, heard him on the iconic Petros and Money Show on AM 570 LA Sports Los Angeles, or watched him back in the college football days, former USC captain Petros Papadakis. Petros, again, thank you
Dragon.
so much for joining me. Really appreciate it. And I'm just curious, just wanted to start it off. How many different ways have you heard someone pronounce your last name?
Oh, well, it's a lot better than it used to be when I was a kid, and people used to call me pot roast Pupadakis. It's a unique name, but not really unique in Greece. It's pretty common. Petros means Peter, and Papadakis or Papadakis or Papadakis. I've heard them all, but ultimately, it is a little bit of a tricky name. But everybody all over the United States knows somebody that's Greek, so
There you go.
usually people can figure it out. But it's very common in Greece. In fact, there's probably hundreds, if not thousands, of Petros Papadakis running around Greece right now.
Somewhere out there.
Yeah, I've met a couple, uh,
Really?
not with the full name, but a
Okay.
lot of Petroses and a lot of Papadakis, as they would say in Greece. But yeah, it's been a weird name, and it's a kind of a funny name to do broadcasting with, but
Yeah.
it's worked out for these years so far, at least.
Well, it works. You remember the name.
Yeah.
There you go. So there's some pros that come to it. So I just wanted to start back on the beginnings. So college football player to TV radio personality. Can you just take me through that transition?
Yeah, I wasn't a very good student in high school. I was a terrible student, and was kind of basically saved by my football career, uh, which was kind of weird. I was a late blooming football star, and got recruited late. Ended up signing with Cal and being too immature to deal with that. And I screwed that up when I was about your age, and left and had to salvage my career at USC. And I ended up being on the team and then kind of acclimating and becoming whatever I was on the field. But I was also an English and American literature major at USC with a minor in Russian literature,
Oh wow.
which is not to sound like I'm super smart. It's really, kind of a useless major. But it was interesting in those times to the writers. And the newspaper back then was a lot more prevalent than it is now. Now the media that covers college football is a lot more digital, and the newspapers are even more digital. But the writers were kind of into me because I was a little bit different. I was a white tailback who answered questions in a little bit more of an obscure manner. I got to playing a little bit and scoring a touchdown here or there, and it kind of made me a little bit more media friendly, so to speak. So, kind of without knowing it, as a player and ultimately as a captain, like you said, I did a lot of interviews, and it just sort of morphed itself, not with my intention at all. Most things in my life I've backed into. And my football career was like that, and my media career was like that too. I just kind of ended up, uh, after a really bad injury, playing one more year at USC. And I mean, people always tell me, like, how do I get hired on radio? How do I get hired to do this or that in media? And my answer is always like, I don't know. I mean, somebody hired me, really early in this process. And I got hired not only to do media, but I got hired in Los Angeles to do media. And so that kind of makes me a little bit of an odd story. And I just started doing local radio and local TV right off the bat. And it just kind of went from there and never let up until, I got a little bit older. So yeah, it just kind of happened. And I mean, I don't want to say that I didn't screw it up, because I feel like I did, but I guess I didn't screw it up so much to where I couldn't stay employed.
Yeah. So it seems like you've
It's hard,
already.
to do those jobs. I got a job on local, I mean, in LA is a pretty big market. And I got a job doing radio in LA when I was like 24. And God knows I burned every bridge, in my life. I had no
Yeah.
idea what I was doing, but that's what I did. And that's, how I started.
So you always had that little or those genes of being on the media side while going through your high or your college days at USC. But when did you officially realize that this was the career path that you wanted to switch into?
Well, I didn't really have a lot going on. And, I didn't know what I was going to do. I mean, right at the end of my college football career, my foot broke very badly to where, I needed a cadaver bone to fix it and I had a staph infection in the bone. So kind of was wrestling with almost losing my leg. And my whole life was sort of just focused on playing one more year. My older brother who played at USC was carted off the field for his last, moments in the uniform. And I didn't want that to be for me. And most actually, even more, my father, who also played at USC. So I wanted to play one more year. And, I had IVs for 4 months every 8 hours and a lot of rehab, a lot of pills. And I came back and played on the little skinny leg. And my whole focus was just that. And when it was over, I realized, I didn't have much of a plan for the future. I wasn't going to be able to play pro football. I could not pass the NFL physical with the foot. The XFL was in their first season ever under Vince McMahon in the year 2001, and they were calling. But my desire to play the sport was very much waning, and it was just kind of a miracle that a guy named Mark Huska, who a lot of people in LA and around know, he works in the tennis world now, but he was working at Fox Sports West at the time, and they had something called the Southern California Sports Report, and they hired me to be a USC correspondent because he saw me doing an interview on TV. Other than that, I was probably going to work at my dad's restaurant, which I did anyway, and just see where that went. But yeah, I didn't really have a plan, and I never really thought I'd be involved in the media in the way I am. It just kind of happened and kind of got more and more intense as the years went on.
Yeah, well, you've had your fair time through getting to know the process and what it takes to really be on the media side. But what would you say have been the highs and lows for working in this industry? But we'll stay on a positive note here. Let's start with the highs.
Well, I mean, I don't know. The highs are, especially if you love football, and that would be a hard question for me to answer at this point in my life. But the highs are definitely that you still get to feel it. You still get to be on the sideline, see the teams come out, hear the bands, be part of it every week. I mean, if we're talking about calling games, you know, that's that's the upside to that. I mean, that is a really special privilege. And I like calling games because the game that you call is just your game. No one else has it. It could be a great game. It could be a terrible game. It could be what everybody thinks is a great game that ends up being a terrible game. It could be what everybody thinks is a terrible game that ends up being a great game. Usually it's somewhere in the middle of all of that. But it's yours and it's uniquely yours. And you get to wrap your whole arm around, both your arms around it with the people you work with. And convey a message and tell a story that's happening in real time where you don't know what's going to happen. But you have to make sure with the people that you're with that it has a beginning and a middle and an end. So that's the high. I like being able to do that with other people. On the radio side, it's very similar, but you have more of an idea what's going to happen. The show is kind of produced in your brain before it happens. It also has to have a beginning and a middle and an end. But you've got to pedal the bike, right? Because in a radio show, if you don't pedal the bike, it just falls over. In a television show, if you over talk, especially if you're calling a game and people have the pictures, you're insulting your audience. You're not giving them a chance to interpret it for themselves. You have to be a little bit more reticent about how much you're talking. And people just don't realize that. People get these jobs and they never shut up. But for me, doing the jobs well, at least what I perceive to be well, or my capacity to do it well, it's very subjective. Doing the jobs well is a high for me. Especially with the people you're with. It's a lot like being on a team. So that part of it I really enjoy. The lows, if you want me to go there, are, I mean, I work at corporations. I work at Fox, which is a gigantic broadcasting corporation. I'm lucky for that. And I work at iHeartMedia, which is the biggest radio company in the world and biggest podcast company in the world. So, you work at a corporation. There's good sides to that and there's downsides to that. And I guess the other downside to it is just, getting old. When I was 25, I was doing this job and guys that I played with, I was calling their games on national TV. And it's like, yeah, I played with that guy. This is what it was like in his recruiting and all that. And that I didn't know any better. I didn't know about the passing of time. It's kind of hard to when you're a kid. But now, I open up my board, and I know you've seen broadcasters' boards, calling a game. And I can, like, on every board almost, I can say, yeah, I played with that guy's dad.
Oh,
you know,
wow.
uh, and it's literally the kids of guys that I played against or with or from my era. So, that's having that perspective is good, but it's also kind of a bummer to realize the football world just kind of perpetuates itself every generation.
Yeah.
There's
Uh,
nothing but ex football players littered all over the landscape,
yeah, all around there. A lot of
man.
connections. A lot of connections. Well, this day and age now, it's a lot more. I would say the media side has experienced a lot more growth. There's a lot more opportunities to be involved and whatnot. But specifically for what you do through radio, how would you describe the industry to a college student, or honestly just anyone who aspires to work in it one day?
It's hard. It's a very interesting. Uh, it's an interesting medium because if you're doing talk radio, uh, it's very different. Even though if your show is podcasted, like you could podcast my show when it's over, but you're still on live, right? And you're doing commercials and you have a clock to deal with, and you're much more. It's not like, this modern discipline of, yeah, I'm going to do a podcast. And yeah, we'll do it around 10 and, hop on at 10:20, doesn't matter, and you just kind of bullshit with your friends. And then, it just kind of goes from there. That's not the discipline of doing like a real corporate radio show with commercials and live commercial reads and all that. So that's a whole discipline. The other part of it is this, when I was younger, when I was around your age, uh, it was really before the internet was the way it was. And the guys on radio, and this isn't the way I am, but the guys on radio were like encyclopedic knowledge guys. They didn't have the internet right in front of them to tell you, the name of this guy or the name of that guy or, the answer to all the world's questions. They had a lot of encyclopedic sports knowledge in their head. And if you wanted information about what happened during the day in sports, if a pitcher wasn't going to pitch later or something, you went to the radio to find out because that was the only thing that was happening in the moment. Well, now all of that stuff is on the phone. Like everybody has all that information in their pocket, whether they want it or not. There's nothing I can tell you on the radio while I'm doing my show that is not already readily available to you. So why does anybody even still listen? Is the question. Well, you have to be entertaining, right? So it's no longer the informational business that it was when I broke into it when I was in my 20s. Now it's all about, do you do an entertaining show? It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. If you said the Chargers were going to win and the Texans won, no one cares about that. They care about your ability to entertain. And I was very lucky to have come around kind of in a time during that transition. Because whether people find me entertaining or not, I'm certainly not informational,
Yeah.
especially sports wise, in an encyclopedic way. There's things I know, but usually there are things that nobody else cares about knowing. So that's like one of the big things that I kind of learned, about doing that job, and getting into it is really hard because to be entertaining, you have to be comfortable. And to be comfortable, you have to have time to be able to do that, time to develop what you're going to be on the air. You have no idea what you're going to be like on the air until you're on the air. You know what I mean? And everything good, everything bad about it. I mean, I've been around some, and I know what your background is, of course. I mean, you can be around some of the great football players or athletes in the history of the world, and you're talking about sports with them, and it's revolutionary to hear, and you can't believe what they're saying, and then you're with the same guy, and the camera comes on, and they're just unable to communicate. I mean, I wasn't the greatest football player of all time, whether I'm a good broadcaster or not, but I could certainly communicate. Like it doesn't necessarily translate into how you're going to be on the air. If you're Joe Montana or something like that. So it's really hard for young people to find a place to be comfortable on air and develop a personality on air to do it. Which is why so many people go to small markets and try to learn and work through those and then get to bigger markets and things like that. But it's definitely a very hard business to break into. And watching people try to do it over the years has frustrated me a great deal, for those people, and for myself in some ways as well. But but it is a very tricky business. If you have talent, it will shine through. But the point is to be able to find a place to get comfortable enough to show that you're talented, and that's not easy.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense because I know nowadays you see a lot more athletes, and then when they retire, whether it's Tom Brady or whoever it may be, just come right into the broadcasting world.
Yeah. Well, there's money in it. Those
Yeah,
guys have agents. Those guys have agents, and those guys want to make money even after the guy retires. The agent says, "Well, what are we going to do now? If I can sell you to Fox for the same amount of money you were making as a quarterback, and I'm going to get paid, let's keep you on the market." You know
why
what I
not?
mean? And that's kind of changed a little bit. When I was younger, Fox was a little bit less star oriented. You know what I mean? But now they're just kind of they're right in that wheelhouse as well. Derek Jeter, A
Yeah,
Rod,
yeah.
and so on, and Tom Brady. My God.
How do you think the future is going to look with all these athletes? I wouldn't say having knowing that they can have a chance in this, but you just see a lot more guys who were former athletes coming into this broadcast industry. How do you think that
Yeah.
will evolve and lay out for the future of what this broadcast industry really is?
Well, I think the discipline of it is still the discipline of it. Like, you can be a fun guy that is fun to talk to and quirky and goofy, like Pat McAfee, right? But when Pat McAfee sits there and has to interview a guy, he figured out how to do it.
Yeah,
I mean, that's the part of it that's hard. The part, and my God, the guy's had a great success. What the point is, when you're an athlete, people interview you. You answer questions. It's not your job to look up and say, how much time do we have left? Do I need to be quick? Do I need to be fast? Do I need to throw it to someone else? You just answer questions and move on. And it's somebody else's job to deal with all the logistics. When you become a host, when you become, an adequate member of a game crew or somebody that works on a TV show, you can't just be America's guest and act like, oh, I just talked through that count. I don't know. I'm just a stupid athlete. Like you have to learn the discipline of actual broadcasting. And some of these guys, like McAfee is an example. I mean, they can really do it. They
yeah.
go on and now he can, conduct interviews. He can sit in a studio panel. For a while, he sat in a booth and did different games. He does alternate broadcasts. You know, uh, not everybody can do that. So sure, there's a lot of people that are going to have an opportunity, and this guy's going to get a podcast, and this guy's going to be here and there. But if any of them are going to have longevity, which is rare, then you better be able to figure out the different disciplines and how to get yourself in and out of just the logistical stuff of those different disciplines, because they're all very different, and there's a little bit of a different code book for all of them. Sideline work, any of that stuff is all very different. So being able to do all that different stuff as a former athlete sets you apart, because so few of them really take the time to learn it. And it is interesting. There's so many ex athletes, and how precise they had to be in their preparation as far as their sport went to be excellent like they were and make a name for themselves. But so many are unwilling or unable or just don't know how to go about that same process for their new job. They think, and a lot of it, I think, has to do with insecurity. You show up and it's a new world and there's cameras and you might not know how to do everything right, and your ego can hurt you. I've seen that happen in the past too. But it is tricky, but I don't worry so much about oversaturation, because ultimately, if you end up having to interview somebody and ask real questions and get to a break and figure out, the actual structure of something, not all those guys or gals can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I know you have experienced this transition firsthand, going back to those college days, playing football at USC. Obviously, the media and cameras were directed to you and your teammates and your coach, and it was all, the team oriented. And now all of a sudden, for you, the scripts flipped, and you're doing the sideline reporting, you're doing the radio hosting, you're doing the analyzing. How do you think those experiences have made your job easier, while I would also think it could lead to some challenges?
I think it's a really interesting question, Cam. When I started working, I can say I very much felt like a fraud. I felt like I was just an athlete or a dumb football player, impersonating what I thought a media guy was supposed to act like. And then as the years went on, I kind of realized I morphed into a media guy. And whenever I talked about athletic stuff, I was kind of impersonating an
Yeah.
athlete. So it kind of, I mean, it's sort of like if you wear the mask long enough, it becomes your face. You know what I mean? But I tried hard to understand what we were doing on the media side. Uh, I had really good mentors who were production people, not an agent, not, really self serving people, but people that were production people that would say, no, you can't say that, or, no, you made a mistake there. You have to apologize for that, and I was very lucky in that regard. But it was a very interesting transition. And, for a long time, for 10 years, I called football games with a guy named Barry Tompkins, who was an old, very famous and still around broadcaster from the Bay Area. You ever seen Rocky Four with
Yep.
Drago? Okay, Barry calls the fight. The Russian is
Okay.
hurt.
Yeah, yeah.
That's Barry.
Yeah.
He called every big fight in the 80s and was a very popular national broadcaster. And I was so lucky. I got to call games with him for 10 years, right? And I was in my mid 20s and he was, around 70 years old. So it was a very interesting balance between the two of us. And I learned a lot. But after those 10 years, they let Barry go. They would have let me go, but I was under contract for one more year. This is a long time ago. And they said something to the effect of, you can go back to the sideline or we'll just pay out your contract and you can go work somewhere else. And I was like, well, geez, I better figure out this sideline thing and see if I could stay employed, you know. So for a couple of years, I went down on the sideline and learned to do that again, and learned to do that with a TV crew, and learned to do that. And I got down there and I smelled what the kids smell like when they're playing. I, see the faces in the face mask, and you listen to them yell at each other and the coaches, and you realize how young everybody is, and it really took me back, that time. And I still get down on the sideline for championship games or for this or that every once in a while. And it always brings me back to my playing career in a certain kind of way, or what it's like to be down there. And I really appreciated that because up in the booth, BSing and, drinking coffee and, the players can look like a video game to you, just on TV and fantasy football. And so many of these guys are faceless to the viewers, because of the helmet and all that. Most people that watch a Super Bowl or football, they big football fans, they couldn't tell you what Saquon Barkley looks like in the face.
Yeah.
That's just the nature of football. So to get back down there, it's always good for me to kind of, feel the passionate part of what, because we're all there to make money, but there are people that are fully committed physically, and those are the
Yeah.
players.
Yep.
And to kind of bring yourself back to that from time to time is a healthy thing. I don't no matter how old you are or how many games you've called.
Gotcha. Well, just change the subject briefly and into the studio. How do you and Matt communicate while you're in the midst of the radio show?
You know, uh, I read something, and I don't want to compare it to this because it sounds so self-serving, but I read something about the Grateful Dead not long ago, the band, and how most of them are dead now, and they can't, like, the way they used to communicate on stage was just, like a shoulder shrug or like, a tip of the head, or they just, after a while, you know what I mean, you kind of, you pick up where somebody leaves off naturally because you have that kind of relationship. And I guess Matt and I, we've been on together for 20 years. I related with that when I heard that quote, just in our rudimentary way
Yeah.
doing sports talk radio. But I mean, so often, people that do shows, and we're maybe sometimes not always in the same place, you know what I mean? But oftentimes, people that do shows like that will be like this. They'll have, their headphones and their mic, and they'll be on a Zoom,
Yeah.
so when I'm done talking and stuff like that. And we don't ever do that. We just don't need to, if we're not in the same place,
Yeah.
just because of how we've done the show for so long. And it's kind of interesting because it's a show with two hosts. There's no designated guy that brings it in, no designated guy that throws it to break. It's kind of like an amoeba in that way. So I'm very proud of that, that we've been able to do that. But yeah, in show, our communication is like now, as far as like with a guest, if we're not in the same room, like, we'll say, you ask the next question or send a text, like, you ask the next two, I'll do this one, I'll say goodbye, you know, simple stuff like that. Or our producer will get in our ear and, say, we got to go to break and, we got to do this, we got to give this away, that kind of stuff. But, no, I'm very, very grateful. And I really try hard in that regard in my work is to work well with the people I'm working with. If you can't treat the people you're working with well, it's that's a terrible thing. So I try my best to exemplify that. I'm not perfect, but it's a pressurized situation, and understanding the people that are with you, what their limitations are, what they do well, what yours are, what you do well. Trying to keep that in perspective while you're on live is important. And I think we've been able to do that for a long time.
Yeah. Well, as you said, you've kind of done it all from the radio, sideline reporting to analyzing. What do you enjoy the most out of all that you have done through this industry?
Well, I mean, the radio show is fun because it's very personal to you, and the relationship that you have with people is very personal. You know what I mean? But it's also tough because, like, the radio show got popular, or I got popular, whatever that term would be, on the radio when I was, not much older than you. And I'm 47 now, and I have two kids and a wife and a mortgage and, private school payments and, all the foibles of adulthood. But people still, and if you've heard my show, people still expect me to act a little bit like a 20-year-old, on the radio. And yeah, I've changed over the years, and people have kind of grown up with me. But, you still have to have that kind of youthful element, and I still kind of have to act like, like I did when I started in a way.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, I dress like an idiot, still, and I guess that's kind of a blessing and a curse. It's been kind of fun to be able to not, have to act super serious about everything and have a fun job. But it is a challenge to kind of have to be a certain kind of way every day and really uh, up, for people, no matter what's going on in your life. That's the job. And I like that. And it's a great responsibility. But calling games is kind of the opposite of that, right? It's not, I mean, if, in my opinion, it's not about me at all. If I'm calling a New Mexico game or Washington State or whatever the hell, I mean, what the hell does anybody care about me? No one's watching. No one ever watches any game because of who's calling. They just don't, unless it's your dad. Like, you know what I mean? Like, most people don't live in our world though, right? Like, people
Yeah.
watch a game that they want to watch. Like, if the Horned Frogs are playing on Hulu, you got to watch it. You don't know who's calling it,
Yeah.
you're watching. So
Absolutely.
when I call a game, I really try, or when I train people, I really try to hammer that into their head. Like, this is our game, but it's not our game. It's not about you or what story you're going to tell or the next thing you want to shoehorn in here. That's the beauty of it. It's not about me at all. The radio show's totally about me. It's a total ego trip. So to be able to do a football game where it's about somebody else and you can tell their story, and it's not about you at all. It's about your crew getting all the breaks in and not making mistakes and hopefully having a great game so everybody feels good about it. You know, that's kind of refreshing. So it's kind of a fun balance in that way. But daily radio grinds you down. You have to I liken it to like CPR. You've got to pump that thing. You have got to constantly be on top of that carcass, pumping its chest to keep it alive. And if you don't, it will die.
Yeah.
It'll die in her.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate it. Um, this has been amazing and perfect. Let's go. Let's go.
My pleasure. I'll do anything you want. I'll do
Um,
next year's thesis.
yeah. Well, you're killing it on the radio show, so we might have to have you come by again. Might have to get you back on Zoom sometime.
Anytime, brother. Anytime, Cam. And if I make it out to Fort Worth, in
Oh,
Fort
please,
Worth,
by all
all
means.
in Fort Worth, all the neons burning bright.